Welcome to episode 38 of the Filmumentaries podcast. This is Jamie Benning talking to you from a very frosty southeast London, England. If you're a new listener, good to have you here. If you're a regular listener, thanks for joining me again. And if you're a patron on patreon.com, thanks so much for your amazing support. It really does mean the world to me. Many of you will have received your posters, your pin badges and magnets by now. Thanks to those of you that have posted a photo of them on social media. It all helps to get this independent, very independent podcast of mine out to a wider audience. I appreciate that. If you'd like to help support the podcast, it's just me doing these, then please do visit patreon.com/Jamie Benning. There are several tiers to choose from. Now that includes an annual subscription, which has been fairly popular. So for just $12, you can help support the research, recording, editing, and distribution of 24 episodes of this podcast. If you upgrade to the next tiers, you get certain goodies from me to show my thanks. And you can check that all out on patreon.com/Jamie Benning, where you'll find all the details. If you listened to my previous episode, number 37, with Dune sound designers Mark Mangini and Theo Green, I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for those of you that have given me feedback. Please do leave reviews if you can. That is a really good way of getting this podcast out to more listeners. So for this episode, I've got well-known producer Howard Kazanjian. It's a name I've been familiar with for many decades now, having seen it on the credits of Raiders of the Lost Ark and Return of the Jedi. I'd heard sometime last year that Howard was releasing a book about his career to be penned by the then very ill J.W. Rinsler. Jonathan, of course, appeared on this podcast back on episode 37 whilst he was being treated for cancer. Then Jonathan sadly passed away in July 2021, but did manage to complete the book. And as Howard told me at the end of this interview you're about to hear, Jonathan did get to see the published version of this book before he passed away. I'd been in touch with Howard since last year, and he was reluctant to talk to me until the book was released, which I understand. This was further complicated by the fact that the book was then released in the UK later than in the US. But he was a man of his word, and when I told him I'd read the book, he was willing to come on the podcast and have a chat. And I do appreciate him giving his time to me. So here's my interview with producer Howard Kazanjian, and I'll be back at the end with a bit more jabbering on. Howard, your beginnings in the industry were kind of at full pelt. You landed in the industry at a time where the studios were beginning their demise, but you ended up working for some of the biggest directors of the day. Can you tell us about that?
Well, also, I was working for Jack Warner as well. He was the last of the moguls, the last of the that had their name on the studio. So I do go back to the end of the studio days where we had heavy equipment and we had the Jack Warners who would take what from cast members. That part was great. In fact, personally, I like the studio days.
You do? And what was it about the studio days that kind of attracted you? Is it something in your personality that craved that kind of structure that was there?
Yeah, I'm a structure type person, but in the olden days, you tended to work with the same crew over and over. It became a family. You knew the crew, you knew how they performed, you knew one prop man from another prop man. You would know which prop man should be on a Western versus a musical, and that went for a gaffer, but a gaffer usually had to work with the DP. DPs would come and go even back then, but going way back prior to my time, if it was a Fox picture, Leon Shamroy usually was the DP. And you could get things much faster. It's not that they did the work for you as a producer or assistant director, but they were there working for the studio. They were a family. They believed in what they were doing. And if you needed a green man right now, you pick up the phone and there's a green man available. You need an additional electrician, pick up the phone, or transportation. You need that car to get somebody somewhere. It happened right now. The challenge with today, you have to plan way ahead, and you have to know if you need that green man. You have to know if you need that extra grip or electrician or that extra vehicle. And that's good too, because your brain is always going, and you have to be prepared and you have to be right on without ordering extra equipment. Back in the Warner Brother days or the studio days, that extra bus was there if you needed it.
Yeah. I guess all of the organization is there already, all of the shortcuts and everything else. But were you aware then that you were in a studio system that was languishing, was dying, and there were these up and coming film directors and producers that were your classmates as well?
Well, yes, definitely. My classmates were anti-studio. I don't have to tell you about Francis Coppola, who wasn't a classmate, but I certainly knew him and worked with him. And of course, George Lucas and many of the others. They didn't like Hollywood. They didn't like the system. They didn't like a studio executive telling them what to do.
And do you think their dream was going to be realized?
Yeah, you could see it happening because there were more independent productions happening. Small ones, very small ones, but those small ones grow.
And you started out as a first assistant director and working with the likes of Hitchcock and Peckinpah. I mean, you must have thought all your birthdays and Christmases had come at once.
It's true. I was very fortunate. I was also in the right place at the right time. And I was a hard worker, and I proved to those people who assigned me to those pictures that I was capable of handling them. And that's part of it. You rarely are you assigned as a gift. You have to work your way up. And I hope the book that we recently wrote shows that.
Yeah, it's certainly full of interesting stories and perspectives that I hadn't read before. You know, I'm very aware of Lucas and Spielberg's kind of, path through the industry, but having those unique perspectives that you give, with the introduction of from Marcia Lucas as well, who, in many ways has been written out of Lucasfilm history for I guess obvious reasons in some ways because of the divorce and the relationship, But it was really good to see her perspective and understand her input into the movies. Was it important to you to give Marcia that chance in the book?
Well, I've kept in touch with Marcia over the years, and she's a wonderful person. And my wife has been in touch with her, and we love Marcia. And I wanted her to write the foreword. So I didn't make the phone call. Jonathan Rinsler made the phone call, and she said, absolutely. And what we got back was not just the introduction, but she started to pontificate. And Rinsler was smart enough and clever enough to know how to integrate that throughout the book. Yeah, there's some fantastic insights there. Jonathan obviously is a fantastic writer, but what was it about Jonathan that attracted you to want him to be the guy that wrote about your career? Well, I had written a great deal. Over the years, people have told me, especially Randall Kleiser, for one, would always tell me every time they'd see me, when are you going to write a book? Howard, you've worked with Hitchcock, you've worked with Peckinpah, you've worked with these greats. You've got to write a book. You've got to tell your story. And oftentimes they would ask me about a certain incident, and I would start talking about it. So I made a lot of notes, kept production reports, call sheets, interviews that I had done over the years. We kept those, but I couldn't write a book on myself. And it took Jonathan Rinsler to be able to take that information, interview the 8 or 10 people that he did, interview me, and put it all together. So I give him all the credit in the world.
In him speaking to those 10 people, did some of those stories kind of re-spark in your memory, or were your interviews done separately? Because I often think that in these situations, I've done some documentary stuff myself where you'll speak to a crew member who will come up with a story and you'll mention it to another crew member and they say, oh my goodness, I forgot about that. And it just brings the memories back. Or did you find the recall of memory quite easy?
I can recall the incidences that I've witnessed in my life. Ones that were interviewed by Rinsler again, I didn't see their interview until he put it together in the second or third draft. So I didn't know what he was saying, and I didn't have to recall. In fact, I laughed about it, several.
So they were new to you in many ways, some of those perspectives.
They brought back certain memories about certain people and problems and challenges. And Mickey Herman says something about Harrison Ford, and Wardrobe Girl tells me about somebody who was smoking pot or whatever, and I didn't realize it at the time. And so reading it, I started laughing. Because, Howard, you didn't see what was in front of you. You didn't know that somebody was high. You didn't know that somebody got lost. And that's the fun I had with those interviews. But I will say, I also told Rinsler anything negative that was said about me goes in the book, because I firmly believe if you believe your good reviews, you better believe your bad reviews too.
Yeah, no, there is definitely room for that in a book. When you've charted somebody to write about you, you've got to kind of roll with the punches and take the punches if they come, I guess. Yeah. So you're clearly a key player in the success of so many of these big movies that I grew up with. What do you think your biggest contribution to films like Raiders and The Empire Strikes Back before that and Return of the Jedi were?
Input, ideas.
And George seems to be one of those people who, like, I've spoken to a number of people that work for George over the years. I've spoken to Nilo Rodis Jamiro, I've spoken to Robert Watts, to name a couple. And he seemed to be very good at employing people that were the best at what they did. So like Nilo, for instance, told me that, he's industrial designer. He didn't know anything about films. He didn't know anything about science fiction. George just needed him to design these vehicles and these costumes later in Return of the Jedi. Did you find that George gave you that trust to give you the ability to do the things that you needed to do?
Yeah. Well, with George, many of the people that were hired way back in the beginning didn't really have a career, and they learned as they went along. But he did, by time Empire Strikes Back came along, he had finely tuned people, very creative people that had great insight and input for him. And he give them an idea and they'd go off and run with it and come back with a conceptual design. Let's say if it was a Joe Johnson or a Ralph McQuarrie, and he'd look at it and say, well, what if we put a tail on this particular object? Or no, I don't like this. I like these two pictures you've done, Joe, combine them. One. And that's how he works. He's brilliant, but he had, and another thing the book points out, team. George may have created all of this, and he's a brilliant person, but it takes a team to make a great movie.
Yeah, and you being a part of that. I mean, Empire Strikes Back was a difficult movie in many ways, wasn't it? Because George was having to kind of, better the film that came before. The expectations are higher. It was a lot of his money. People, of course, knew Star Wars by that stage, and no doubt were trying to charge more money than they would have if it wasn't a Star Wars movie for their services. What was your job in Empire Strikes Back? Because you're uncredited as a producer, but you were working on The Empire Strikes Back.
Yes. At the end of Star Wars, George told me to be, and we were preparing the sequel to American Graffiti, and we were even doing a rewrite on Radioland Murders that got pushed way back. George said, I want you in every Empire meeting because you're going to be producing the third one. So that's where it started. And Gary Kurtz was busy in London on another film. And so when the script came through, I broke it down I boarded it. We actually did 2 boards, one that would be shot live action and one for ILM effects. I didn't tell ILM how to do it. I said, this is the board and these are the effects we need. So we did that. And then I went off, I stayed there here in the United States. I did take one trip to London during the beginning of Empire Strikes Back. And when Empire ran into difficulty, I went back to London for the last 2 weeks of filming, and most of that was Yoda at the time, and then came back and handled most of pre-production. And Gary, again, was busy on a project, and Gary came in for the timing of the picture and the mix of the picture. And my job at that time was vice president of production of all production. And the difficulty with the picture was it went over budget. And there was a problem with the bank, obviously. And so I took over the picture prior to being finished, where I could report, do a new budget, say this is what it's going to cost, and handle the rest of the picture. That's why I was uncredited. Mm. Mm. And I didn't know I would be uncredited until I saw the picture.
Sure. Yeah. Well, we have the Internet Movie Database these days, don't we? So at least the credit exists.
Well, you know, when it did a reboot years later, and George kind of redid the visual effects and added some stuff, and actually with all 3 films, there was another producer credited on it. And he certainly didn't do as much as I did.
Rick McCallum, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, and Rick was a terrific guy and should have gotten that credit on the redo, but I got left out. And it doesn't bother me today. I know what I did, I know what I contributed, and we move on. Worse things have happened to me than others.
Yeah, I'm sure. I wonder how, as a producer, somebody who's trying to keep the budget in order and making sure that, you know, things are not being going over time and over money, how do you kind of balance that with the need sometimes for a film to go over budget? Like The Empire Strikes Back is revered as one of the best films in its genre, if not one of the best films ever, by many people. You see these polls year on year, and The Empire Strikes Back is always in the top 5 at least. How do you, therefore, as a producer, kind of balance that idea that you've got to keep a lid on things financially and in terms of time, but at the same time, maybe it did need to go over budget, maybe it did need to go over time to reach those heights?
Well, if you're an independent production and you have a bond on the picture, and I've worked with a bond, you can't go over budget. Or if you do go over budget, they're going to take over and you're out the door. And the director may be out the door. With Lucasfilm or an independent or even a studio picture, if you have to spend an additional $100,000 on a particular set, let's say, then you look ahead and say, where can I save that $100,000? Is there another set where I don't need that second corridor? Or do a 180 reverse and shoot down the same corridor? And that's the way you have to think. But you can't lose the quality, can't give up the quality of the picture. And so it's a juggling act, and it's not easy. But I will say that every picture that I personally have budgeted and has been approved by Lucasfilm or a studio has come in on budget. I mean, the budgets I do are very, very detailed. They don't say we're going to rent 30 Avis rent-a-cars. My budget will say Avis number 1 car is going to do this, number 2 car is going to, and you just have to, part of it's luck and a great deal of it's skill. Can't go over budget unless you have to.
I guess in a way, as a producer, you're kind of like pre-directing in your head, you're pre-editing, you're pre-everything, because you're trying to imagine and write down and record what these costs are going to be in the future. You've got to travel forward in time in some way in your head to think what those costs might be. And I guess that comes from experience, right? Working with some of those big directors in your early days, being around those people and seeing the mechanics of it all.
Well, it's easier if you're shooting in the United States. If you're shooting in London, as we did with so many pictures, you have the fluctuation of the pound or the lira if you're in North Africa, or the French franc, and that fluctuates. So you might do a budget. I'll give you an example. Our budget for Raiders of the Lost Ark was $20 million. That was it. George owned it. George owned the copyright, but Paramount was putting up the $20 million. So I did a budget based on the pound at that time. And I turned it over to Paramount to read, and they came back and said, "You're several $100,000 over budget." And I said, "No, I'm not." And I went back and I looked at it. And then finally, both of us, both Paramount and myself, realized that I'd do the budget one day where the pound was a certain number, and then they'd do the budget and it was a different number. So we had to lock in a number. No matter if it went up or down, this is what the budget is. But the challenges are exactly that. If it's George Lucas's personal money, and you're going to spend, let's say, $25 million of it in Europe, and the pound starts to fluctuate, and now it's 26 or 27 million, well, a George Lucas would understand that. But does he have the additional $2 million?
And so when you worked on Return of the Jedi, everything had led to that point, I guess, because it was probably the biggest film ever made at that point, I would imagine. In terms of effects, I know there were more effect shots in it than any other movie beforehand. It's a huge, huge production. What was it like entering into a project like that? Were you daunted? You strike me, Howard, as a man who doesn't doubt himself. You seem to be somebody who is very confident about their abilities. But did you have any reservations going into that? Any nervousness?
No. Now that's a hard answer. And it's not egotistical, but no. You just have to believe in yourself and believe in the people you're working with, and pick carefully. I went to after Raiders, I went back to, and before Jedi, went back to London to meet with some of the crew members, because I wanted to make sure that the crew members that had worked on Raiders, Empire, and Jedi were the ones that I wanted. We made very few changes.
Yeah, you've got that kind of shorthand, haven't you? Then with the people you've worked with before, you kind of know what to expect. They know you, you know them, and it just sort of smooths the way, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, that's true here in the United States too. You know the people, you research the people. You just, if you've never hired a production designer, let's say, you look at that person's films in advance, you meet with that person, and you have to do your homework. And you go by gut feeling as well.
Yeah, you talk about that in the book, about some of those gut feelings you had in terms of your kind of creative input, coming up with some of the ideas for dialogue in Raiders, I think you said that they kind of took your line, "I hate snakes," or in for Raiders, but also your input about the ghosts at the end of Return of the Jedi, or cutting a certain scene or adding a certain scene. It's great that you're in a position to be able to do that with George Lucas, with not necessarily historically a creative job, I guess, as producer, but George was allowing that, because it must have been a difficult production for him as well, and for you, because it was across 2 continents. You're working with a director you'd not worked with before, with an editor that you'd not worked with before. How was that, working with Richard Marquand and Sean Barton?
Well, George always believed that once you pick a director, he should be able to pick the DP and the editor. And I liked it. Richard was one of the nicest guys, one of the nicest directors I've ever worked with. And I will say, Not that every director does that, but many directors will blame their assistant, will blame a DP, will say something negative about somebody. And Richard wasn't that way at all. I've never heard a bad word out of his mouth. I think that on Jedi, if I had it to do over again and it was my pick, I would have picked a different DP. On the editor, we had George. Eventually, we had George Lucas. We had Marshall Lucas step in. We had Dwayne Dunham step in. We didn't have a problem with the editor.
Yeah. I spoke to Sean a few weeks back, actually. I went to visit him in his house and I interviewed him. And he said to remind you of the 1968 Ford Thunderbird that you bought him. He said, I had it for a number of years in the States and I brought it back home and I enjoyed that. He said, I was always very appreciative of that from Howard. So
I haven't seen him or talked to him since. But in our business, you may not see or talk to somebody for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And when you do, it's like yesterday. You just pick up and keep going.
Yeah, you talk about that in the book, in your interviews, about the family kind of environment that Lucasfilm fostered. And I work in television myself, and I work on productions where we might travel, to Myanmar, for instance. We might spend a month there, and then I might never see those people again. It's a strange industry that we work in, isn't it? The entertainment industry, because you create these amazing bonds with people, and then they're gone. Do you miss the kind of camaraderie of being on a production?
I do.
I do. And is the book in some way a way for you to kind of remind yourself of those moments, those fun moments?
Yes.
Is it difficult looking back, or is it fun looking back?
It's no, it's not difficult looking back. You have to look back and say, what a wonderful time I had. What a great time I had working with, even Sam Peckinpah or Alfred Hitchcock. My goodness, Alfred Hitchcock. He was the only director that really mentored me. And that's in the book. Really, grabbed me and said, sit down and let's talk about him. And why and how. And those are great moments. And you won't see those again. But if you keep working in this industry, you're going to learn something else. You're going to meet somebody else that's going to help you, or you're going to help them. Now it's my turn to start helping people. Has been for a while.
Yeah. Yeah, it's nice to have that opportunity, isn't it? When you've had somebody who's meant so much to you as a mentor, I think it's always good to pass these things on, isn't it? And I think your book does that. It kind of talks about the experience that you had, and although the industry has changed so much even in the last couple of years, what with one thing and another, it really does give an interesting insight into things. Is there any part of you that wishes you did go down the director route? Because you started as the assistant director and then became producer.
Yeah, not so much anymore, but yes, it did bother me. And there were certain pictures that I had the opportunity to direct, and I decided that I was better as a producer on them than a director. And then once you establish yourself as a producer, a lot of people will say the word Hollywood doesn't believe you can direct.
Odd. Yeah, you get kind of put in you pigeonholed, aren't you, into
like an actor?
Way.
Yes.
Yeah, you get typecast.
Absolutely, you do. You also get typecast where you go back to a studio and they expect you to do another huge production like a Star Wars, but do it for half the price.
Yeah, that was.
And at a studio, you can't do it for half the price. At Lucasfilm, when you're independent and you can control all of these things, and you don't have extra people and extra transportation. As an example, in the neighborhood I live now, there's a lot of commercials and motion pictures that are made. to close down the street. And all. I'll tell you, with most commercials today, there are more pieces of transportation, trucks, than we had on Return of the Jedi, and we were shooting on location for months. I'm talking about in Buttercup Valley, California, on the Arizona border, and in Northern California. But you're able to control that. Studios, although they're very watchful and careful with the budget, goes crazy. I think you can take any studio picture, and that's $100 million, and in the independent world, getting the same quality, the same cast, all of that, you can do it for perhaps a quarter less.
Really? That different? Yeah, I mean, George, of course, wanted to be able to control, his own creative endeavors by not being in the studio system, but in a way never fully realized that hope of going north and taking everybody with him and fostering young filmmakers and everything else. I mean, obviously he's had some amazing feats in his career with ILM and everything else, but
also to be fair, when it came to ILM, George put a lot of money into ILM. I paid for the effects and the labor. I didn't have to pay for the building. I didn't have to pay for the millions of dollars that George put into it before we got there. I didn't have to pay for my office. I didn't have to pay for a lot of things because George said, I'm building this thing and no one can afford it except him at the ranch. Now, whatever your expenses are, an editing room that George built was magnificent. Let's say it cost $100,000 per cubicle. You can't charge $100,000 or a proportion of that off. George would say whatever the going rate is in Hollywood. So the going rate per month in Hollywood may have been $5,000 or $6,000. That's what we were charged.
Yeah.
But we had beautiful conveniences and beautiful, theaters and magnificent sound and projection and all of that.
You talk about the kind of difficulties of moving away and moving out of LA, but then also moving back after working on these big productions. How much of a challenge was it kind of coming back to Los Angeles, and how much had it changed in the time that you'd been further north?
It had changed a lot. But also keep in mind, George was going through his divorce, and he said, I'm not going to be making pictures for a long, long time. And you're welcome to stay, Howard. But I said to George, let me go back to Hollywood. Let me continue to get better as a producer. And then when, you're back up, I'll come back up. Well, things changed and that didn't happen. Then suddenly I had 2 more children, and George asked me if I would go back to Europe on Young Indiana Jones. And I didn't want to take 3 young kids back to Europe.
Yeah.
But Hollywood was changing, absolutely. And it was difficult to go back. It was very difficult. Also, I was going back where people looked at me and said, George Lucas, Francis Coppola, Howard Kazanjian hate Hollywood. And that wasn't me, but I sure got labeled that. I worked in Hollywood, absolutely. But everybody put that tinge on you that you really weren't a Hollywood guy. You were an independent. You didn't like the people. You didn't like the studios and all of that. And it was just the opposite.
It seems like the dream of George's wasn't fully realized because of the divorce in many ways between him and Marcia, and clearly devastating for him and for her, I'm sure. Do you put it down to that as well? Do you think that the dream wasn't fully realized because personal life gets in the way?
Yeah, definitely. But what really happened, and he built this ranch, and even before the ranch was built, George always wanted mostly writers, to be living at the ranch and to be able to work at the ranch and create their work at the ranch, and at lunchtime sit with each other and discuss their script and go get on a horse and ride around or go to the gym or go swimming. And that's why he built this magnificent ranch. But what happened? He did 2 films, Indiana Jones films and the Star Wars films, and that tied him up wall to wall. And that was one of the reasons for the divorce. He had to become a workaholic. And there was the ranch, this big, beautiful ranch. But his dream of what he wanted to do never materialized. He wanted to make small pictures too. Even after he retired, or even after he sold to Disney, he said to me, I still want to make small pictures. And I said, how small? And he said, I don't even care if they get distributed.
He's still got that creative impulse then.
Well, yeah, I think he does. I don't know. I'm not in his brain right now, so I don't know.
Yeah, but it seems that way.
Child and a new wife, or a fairly new wife, and all of that. I have no idea.
Yeah, I see him now and again, because I work on Formula One motor racing, so he's obviously a big motorsport fan. In fact, he was in Qatar in the last race last week. It's funny, you sort of turn your head and there's this huge figure of movie making next to you, but he's just there for the cars. It's funny, people think every day is a Star Wars day for George, but some days it's just a day out.
I think he has forced himself. I think he has to say, I'm out of it. I don't want to think about it. I'm in other things like motor racing.
Yeah, I think selling to Disney was a big surprise. Was it a surprise to you when that happened?
Yeah, but then immediately I realized why. I mean, he had a new wife. His wife was a financial advisor, as you may know, on television in Chicago. And if George had got hit by a bus, the ranch and everything else would basically be worthless. By selling Lucasfilm and doing an outline for the next 3 Star Wars films, he was able to get those billions of dollars for it. But I don't know. I mean, who would have negotiated? His lawyers, his wife, his children, with Disney? What would have happened to the ranch? Well, you still can say what will happen to the ranch if George got hit by a bus today.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
because it's a beautiful facility. And I think he looked at that, and he also said, my next big endeavor is the museum. I've been working on for a long while. I mean, it did surprise me, but I understood.
Yeah, I was the same. I remember I went down to breakfast. I was in Abu Dhabi working on the Formula One, and my colleague who knows nothing about movies says, "Oh, I hear that George Lucas has sold to Disney." And I said, "No, that's not true." And then when I read the press and everything, I thought, I get it. He's unburdening himself of this weight. I completely understand that. Yourself, having worked on all these amazing movies, Howard, did you collect anything from the movies? I'm just thinking of the kind of things that George has surrounded himself with and unburdened. Did you in any way keep hold of any props or any items that you still cherish, or have you kind of got rid of all of that stuff by now?
I do have some. I wasn't like most people who took stuff. I was the one, especially with Lucasfilm, that would say, we've got to preserve these things, because that was my marching order, and keep everything locked up, and don't let people steal it. Well, some certain things were stolen, and people say, well, why didn't you take a lightsaber? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you that? Well, my job was not to take it. Yeah. My job was to see that nobody took it.
Yeah.
So I have a few things. George gave me a few things. But in hindsight, I look at these auctions that are going on, and Indiana Jones is this, and Indiana Jones's hat, and a headdress or a helmet from Darth Vader sells for $1 million, and I'm going, oh my God! I had one on my desk that we threw out because it had a scratch on it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing how there's now a whole industry, isn't there, in props these days? Whereas in your day, in the 80s, they were made for the screen for that moment, and they were discarded in many ways. Yeah.
Or even one sheets. The person who introduced Jonathan was Brandon Allinger, who's the COO, if you don't know Brandon, of the Prop Store. And very successful, and they just finished a London auction, and I was surprised by the prices they got for certain things.
Yeah, it's kind of unreal what's happening at the moment. There was one, not Star Wars related, but one of Alejandro Jodorowsky's Dune books that he sent around all the studios in the 70s sold for $2.9 million last week. I mean,
or the elf costume that sold 2 weeks ago for $175,000. The elf costume.
I don't understand it. I mean, I understand some of these items are important, but I suppose when you've got enough money to throw 3 million at a book or hundreds of thousands at a costume, then, we're not really talking about money anymore, are we? We're just...
We're not. Money.
Yeah, there's a lot of that crypto money out there, I think.
And maybe that person can get $3.5 million in a few years for the book. But I'm not so sure about some of these other things. I'm not so sure that certain Indiana Jones or Star Wars or Batman memorabilia will really maintain this value.
Yeah, because once the generation of fans dies out, is it just going to be our kids left with all this trash ultimately? I think, what do you think about, though, the preservation of some of these things, because the preservation of film is an important thing. The preservation of certain artifacts, can be important. You have the Museum of the Motion Arts. Is that something you think is a worthwhile endeavor?
Yes, I do. But I believe that with a lot of things, whether it be the Civil War or something like that. I think it's very important that we preserve our history.
Yeah, and preserve our stories. And that's what's great about these books, is that we're able to look back on all of these moments and it's a special kind of time travel in a way, isn't it? Being able to recount these stories for you and for us as readers to be able to travel back in time and kind of experience those things that you went through, because it's never going to happen again, is it? And it's an important thing to record and to have for posterity. Yeah.
Time travel is a good name for that. Well, I didn't, the key was when I really started getting into it, and I told Jonathan Minsler this, I said, I don't want to write it about me. I want to write it for young potential filmmakers and others to understand the good and the bad, the ups and downs of our industry. And I hope I laid that out in the book. The other subtle remark that I wanted to say is I started at the very bottom. I think everybody has to start somewhere, not at the bottom, but to start at the top, to become a director overnight, or so many of these young filmmakers and others people in the world want to start at the top. And you can't. You might start there, but if you don't know about the people who are going to support you and do the work for you, you're going to fail.
Mm. Yeah.
And I don't know how strong that is in the book, but that's very important for me. Yeah, know your team, respect them, understand what they do for you. You have to. Not only in our business, in any business.
One final thing then, Howard, you mentioned that in the book that you talk about being an ambassador of goodwill for the team. Why is that your role? And what does that entail? What do you do to become this ambassador of goodwill on set and on a production?
I think it's the way you handle yourself, and perhaps the way you were trained by your parents. I think it's a lot easier to talk to somebody as opposed to fight with somebody. It's difficult to argue with somebody. It's easy to understand their side of a viewpoint. And I'm there to help. I'm there to give answers. I'm there to facilitate their job and my job. And I want to understand the people. I want to understand who they are and what's bothering them, and why maybe they're cranky on the set that day. Do they get a traffic ticket on the way to work? Is one of their children sick? Do they have a fight with their spouse? And you try to help them. If that's what you call being an ambassador, that's me. But you got to do your job at the same time. Now we move on to something else.
Yeah. Well, good luck with whatever that is, Howard. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed my slightly shorter than usual chat there with producer Howard Kazanjian. Please do share it on social media. Coming up on the Filmumentaries podcast are my conversations with the director of Elstree 1976 and Hollywood Bulldogs, John Spira. I also, just last week, spoke to the author of those amazing limited run large format books. You'll have seen them for Raging Bull, The Deer Hunter, and now Train Spotting. That's Jay Glennie. Lives just a stone's throw from me, just over the river in Essex. That was a good chat. Like us, he's a big fan of movies, and he's one of those people, like John Spira as well, has got themselves involved in making things about the movies that they love. Tonight I'm recording a conversation between me, the director of Jodorowsky's Dune, Frank Pavich, Sobi, the man who stepped in and won the Christie's auction of the Jodorowsky Dune book, crazy, and friend and prop collector extraordinaire Dan Lanigan. That's going to be a fun one. Thanks for joining me for this episode, and I hope you can do so again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.